Today, let's keep talking about how the one country, two systems promise failed in Hong Kong. Back in 2006, something pretty big happened. The Civic Party was founded. Then, on November 11th that year, Alan Leong, one of its leaders, announced that he was going to run for chief executive of Hong Kong. That was a bombshell at the time. Why? Because since the 1997 handover, there had only been two chief executives, Tung Chee-hwa and Donald Tsang, and both were elected without any real opponents. There was only one candidate each time. It was like electing Xi Jinping as president. Any objections? None! And boom, you've got your leader. So why weren't there any challengers? Because the nomination rules made it almost impossible. The chief executive was chosen by an election committee, 400 members at first, later expanded to 800. But to even qualify as a candidate, you needed at least 100 nominations. And guess what? That committee was tightly controlled by the government. Most of the members came from these functional constituencies, aligned with the establishment. So unless you were the government's favourite, getting 100 nominations was a fantasy. But things shifted around 2006 and 2007. That year's election committee had 800 members, and although most still came from the usual power blocks, there were also seats from the Legislative Council and district councils. The pro-democracy side managed to gather about 130 votes in total. That gave Alan Leong an opening. He wasn't expecting to win, but he wanted to be a formal candidate. His goal was simple, to make it a real race. Just give the people a choice. So on November 11th, he announced his run for chief executive. And by early 2007, he had secured 132 nominations, crossing the 100 vote threshold and becoming an official candidate. That meant, for the first time ever, the chief executive election wasn't a one-man show. Donald Tsang suddenly had to campaign. His slogan was, "I'll do a good job." Basically, he was saying, I'll follow orders from Beijing and serve Hong Kong well. But a lot of Hong Kongers found it pretty weak. People made all kinds of parodies online, mocking how submissive it sounded. Alan Leong, on the other hand, had a more striking message. He asked, "Who wants to win a race with no opponent?" That line hit hard. It exposed the truth about previous elections. They were just for show. If one side keeps scoring goals and the other team doesn't exist, is that really a victory? His point was, for the election to mean anything, there had to be real competition. It couldn't just be Donald Tsang handpicked by the government. Leong's presence in the race was, in his own words, necessary to give the election any legitimacy at all. He also had another powerful slogan in Cantonese. You only become the true boss when you have a choice. In other words, if Hong Kongers wanted to be the real masters of their city, they needed the power to choose. Not just between government-approved candidates, but between someone picked by the authorities and someone they genuinely support. These ideas really resonated with people. And because it was a proper contest, the two candidates even had a televised debate hosted by Rita Fan, where they addressed issues Hong Kong citizens truly cared about.
我初初宣布參選嘅時候，有人話我傻。而家越嚟越多人加入我個行列喎，我相信呢個係香港人為咗打破小圈子選舉呢一種決心，創造咗一個又一個嘅奇蹟。剛剛喺上星期，我去慈雲山探咗一個獨居嘅老人家，張伯佢82歲啦，佢捉住我手，眼泛淚光咁樣講：梁先生，我希望有生之年我可以親手投你一票。張伯，我喺度向你承諾，我會盡我一切之所能，喺2012年還翻你手上應該有嗰一票，再創另一個奇蹟。
After the debate, Alan Leong's popularity kept rising, but the 2007 chief executive election wasn't based on a public vote. It was still in the hands of the 800-member election committee. So no matter how high your approval rating was, it didn't mean much if those 800 people didn't support you. On March 25th, 2007, the result came out. Donald Chiang won easily with 649 votes. Alan Leong got 123 votes and lost. Another lawmaker, long hair Lung Kwok Hung, didn't take the process seriously. He threw his ballot on the floor and submitted a blank vote. Even so, Leong's campaign still made history. Why? Because under the Chinese Communist Party's rule, this was the first time there was any kind of real competitive election between an opposition figure and a government-backed one. Since the CCP took power, there had never been this kind of contest. Sure, the party had done some internal voting before, like so-called competitive elections within its own system, but a race between the opposition and the ruling side. This was the first, and Leong became the first candidate in CCP-controlled territory to enter an election without official government nomination. It was a moment that stood out. Back then, everyone was watching Taiwan's presidential election. But in my view, the 2007 Hong Kong chief executive election was also a major milestone in the evolution of one country, two systems. In 2008, the Civic Party used the momentum from Leong's campaign and performed strongly in the Legislative Council election. They won 6 seats, becoming the second largest opposition party in Hong Kong. The Democratic Party was still number 1. But the Civic Party rose quickly. Many of their core members were lawyers, and they believed in using the legal system to check the government. They often filed judicial reviews, bringing lawsuits on behalf of citizens to test the limits of the law. For example, during the construction of the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge, they helped an elderly woman file a lawsuit against the government for environmental reasons. They also helped a Filipino domestic worker who had lived and worked in Hong Kong for 29 years apply for permanent residency. At the time, there were around 300,000 Filipino domestic workers in Hong Kong, and none of them could get permanent residency, no matter how long they stayed. The Civic Party challenged that rule, arguing the legal definition was too narrow. In the first ruling, the court sided with the worker. That result shocked the government. If 300,000 domestic workers could one day qualify for residency and public benefits, it would seriously impact Hong Kong's system. Later, the Court of Final Appeal overturned the decision. Still, those cases brought criticism. Some people said the Civic Party was too focused on legal theory and didn't consider practical consequences. But one thing was clear. They had entered a period of strong growth after 2006, and they played a key role in pushing Hong Kong's legal and political boundaries. Back in 2007 and 2008, the biggest conflict between Hong Kong and the central government centered around the political reform plans for the 2012 Chief Executive and Legislative Council elections. In December 2007, the National People's Congress issued an interpretation of the Basic Law. And what did it say? Basically, it ruled out the possibility of a general election for chief executive in 2012, claiming that the timing wasn't right. At most, only minor changes could be made. This decision triggered changes in Hong Kong's political scene. The opposition began to split. On one side, there were the moderates, like the Democratic Party. Their approach was more pragmatic. They believed that even if the reform plan wasn't ideal, it was better to accept it first and try to improve it later. Their idea was, progress, even if just an inch, is still progress. But on the other side, the more radical Democrats saw things differently. They believed the so-called reform was a trick, just a way to delay or block true universal suffrage. If they accepted it now, they feared real democracy might never happen. So they pushed for genuine universal suffrage, real competitive elections. And over time, the division between the moderate and radical camps deepened. It eventually led to a major political event in 2009, the 5 constituencies referendum. The idea for the referendum came from the League of Social Democrats, particularly from Wong Yukman. He proposed a bold plan. Since the central government refused to allow universal suffrage in 2012, he suggested that lawmakers elected by the people should resign. Then, by running again in special elections, they could turn those elections into a de facto public referendum. The goal? To let voters express their support for full democracy and use that mandate to pressure Beijing. At that time, the Civic Party was divided. Some members wanted to join the movement, others were strongly against it. One of the party's senior figures, Ronnie Tong, later recalled how in 2009 they held an all-night debate near the Hong Kong airport. One side insisted they should join the 5-district referendum, but Tong strongly objected. He believed that if Hong Kong ever wanted real universal suffrage, it had to build trust with Beijing. Without mutual understanding, pushing too hard could backfire. In the end, the Civic Party, led by Alan Leong and Tanya Chan, decided to join. In early 2010, they resigned from the Legislative Council along with members of the League of Social Democrats and then ran again in by-elections. However, the referendum didn't go as planned. The Democratic Party and other moderate pan-democratic groups chose not to participate. Without broad support, voter turnout was low, only 17.1%. That was far below their target. The organizers had hoped for at least 50% turnout to show a strong public mandate. But the result fell short of expectations, and the political impact was limited. Now think about it. 17.1% voter turnout was far from the 50% goal. But even though the referendum failed to meet expectations, it still ended up reshaping Hong Kong's entire political landscape. Why? Because it marked a turning point where the radical Democrats began to adopt a more confrontational strategy, believing that was the only way to push forward political reform. But this approach seriously upset Beijing. The central government saw the 5 constituencies referendum as a provocation, an act of defiance. Before this, the Chinese government actually had a relatively good impression of the Civic Party. But after the Civic Party joined the referendum, that changed. Beijing put them on the blacklist, seeing them as unreliable, maybe even worse than the Democratic Party. There's also a side story worth mentioning. We talked about it in the last episode. How in May 2010, the Democratic Party, led by Albert Ho, entered into direct talks with the liaison office and struck a deal with Beijing. In the end, they accepted the central government's revised plan for the 2012 political reform package. That package was later passed in the Legislative Council with 46 votes in favor. But despite supporting the plan, the Democratic Party didn't gain much. In fact, many pan-democratic groups saw their actions as a betrayal of the democracy movement. During the July 1st protest in 2010, people were openly criticizing the party, calling them Team B of the DAB, Hong Kong's pro-Beijing establishment party. That's a harsh label, because the DAB was seen as the CCP's loyal partner. So if the Democratic Party was being called Team B, it meant they had totally lost the public's trust. In the 2012 Legislative Council elections, this backlash showed up at the ballot box. Many pan-democratic groups openly campaigned against the Democratic Party, urging voters to block them. And it worked. The Democratic Party's seats dropped from 8 to 6. Their influence clearly declined. So from around 2008 to 2012, we saw a shift in Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. The moderate centrist voice, represented by the Democratic Party, started to fade, while the more radical wing took the lead. I once read an article that said Beijing bears some moral responsibility for this. The argument goes like this. The Democratic Party took a risk by engaging with Beijing and backing the 2012 reform plan. In return, the central government should have offered them something, some recognition, or at least a working relationship. But after the deal was passed, Beijing basically cut off contact. There was no follow-up, no real communication channel. And then, in the 2012 election, the Democratic Party suffered a major setback, losing both seats and influence. Within the broader pan-democratic camp, their voice became weaker and weaker. So of course the party would start questioning itself. What was the point of cooperating with Beijing if it only led to us losing power? That loss of faith ended up pushing the more radical factions to the forefront. In that sense, Beijing made a strategic mistake. They missed an opportunity to build trust with a moderate democratic force. Instead, they left the Democratic Party isolated and abandoned, and that helped accelerate the rise of the radicals. This was a major turning point in Hong Kong's political evolution. By 2014, everyone in Hong Kong was aware of the 831 decision from the National People's Congress. It stated that the 2017 chief executive election would allow universal suffrage, but only under the condition that all candidates be approved by a nominating committee. After the failure of the 2012 reform, many Hong Kongers had pinned their hopes on 2017. Beijing had made it clear universal suffrage would happen. So when discussions began, the pan-Democrats proposed three nomination methods: civil nomination, party nomination, and nomination by committee. But the 831st decision firmly stated that according to Article 45 of the Basic Law, the chief executive must be nominated by a broadly representative committee. Beijing also repeatedly emphasized that the chief executive must be someone who loves the country and loves the party. That was the baseline. This triggered major conflict between Hong Kong society and the central government. And as we all know, the umbrella movement followed soon after. One of the biggest changes brought by the movement was the rise of young political voices, people like Joshua Wong and Agnes Chow, who were still very young. The movement began with class boycotts by students, followed by business strikes and public support. Political parties then stepped in behind the students. These young activists had two clear traits. First, they emphasized Hong Kong's local identity and autonomy. Second, some even began to advocate for independence. The emergence of this new, radical youth movement had a deep influence on Hong Kong's politics over the next 10 years. This brings up a key question. Why, 15 years after the handover, did Hong Kong still lack a unified identity? Why did radical localist youth rise to the front of the political stage? I read an analysis that offered a convincing view. It said Hong Kong had indeed developed rapidly after the handover. In global terms, it was one of the fastest growing regions, but mainland China was growing even faster. With its unique system, Hong Kong became one of the world's major financial centers. According to some data, it had more billionaires than any city except New York. On one hand, that shows Hong Kong's strength in finance and wealth creation. But on the other hand, it also highlights severe wealth inequality. Economic development in Hong Kong wasn't inclusive. Big corporations and tycoons benefited greatly, but ordinary people, especially the younger generation, saw very little gain. Income growth for youth was slow. What made things worse was Hong Kong's housing system. Unlike the mainland or most of the world, where property is sold by the square meter, Hong Kong sells by the square foot. A 100 square meter flat is considered luxury. Most people spend their lives in 15 or 20 square meter units. Housing became the heaviest of the three big mountains weighing down Hong Kongers. For many young people, the future felt hopeless. The article I read, published in 2019, said clearly these young people didn't protest to solve social problems. They took to the streets to vent their frustration. What they expressed was anger at reality. Not a plan for reform, but a cry from despair. In reality, the deep-rooted social problems Hong Kong was facing back then, like the hopelessness felt by many young people, couldn't really be solved by simply having universal suffrage for the chief executive. But what could the youth do? With no real way out, they turned their frustrations into political demands. So the more radical young generation took to the streets, driven by two main goals. First, they wanted genuine universal suffrage for the chief executive. Second, they pushed for localization. They believed Hong Kong's economic decline was due to being too closely tied to mainland China. If Hong Kong could become more autonomous, like deciding its own future, perhaps things would improve. After 2014, new political forces emerged. Joshua Wong and his group became more active. A young activist named Leung started the slogan, "Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times." Groups like People Power, which had split off from the League of Social Democrats, also began to grow. These were even more radical than their predecessors. Like mushrooms after rain, new parties and movements started spreading. Hong Kong politics became increasingly radicalized. Then came 2019, the anti-extradition bill movement, which changed everything. It started with a murder case. A young man from Hong Kong killed his girlfriend in Taiwan, then fled back to Hong Kong. Because there was no extradition agreement between Hong Kong and Taiwan, he couldn't be sent back for trial. So the Hong Kong government proposed amending the extradition law. The amendment would allow suspects to be sent not only to Taiwan, but also to mainland China. This sparked massive public concern. Many Hong Kongers didn't trust the mainland legal system. They feared the government might use the law to extradite political dissidents to China. So people took to the streets in protest. It became the largest political movement since the handover. What the world came to know as the anti-extradition or anti-send to China movement. It started with opposing the bill, but the demands quickly grew. Protesters began chanting 5 demands, not one less. The most radical groups, especially the so-called brave fighters, became more aggressive in both action and slogans. Later that year, in the 2019 District Council election, which, following the 2012 reforms, no longer used appointed seats, the opposition camp achieved an overwhelming victory. Out of more than 400 seats, the Pan-Democrats won 388. It was an unprecedented success. Groups like the Democratic Party and Civic Party all made big gains. Riding this momentum, opposition parties began to meet and strategize. They saw a chance to win a majority in the Legislative Council. This became known as the 35-plus plan. The idea was to organize primaries, coordinate candidates, and use vote-sharing tactics so that every winnable district was secured. If they could win over half the seats, they could block all government proposals in Legaco. The goal was to paralyze the system and force international attention and sanctions against Hong Kong and Beijing. At this point, the central government began to take action. First, it announced that all elected district council members had to take an oath of allegiance, part of the one country, two systems framework. Then, using the pandemic as justification, the Hong Kong government postponed the Legislative Council election. On June 30th, 2020, Beijing bypassed Hong Kong's legislature and directly imposed the national security law through the National People's Congress Standing Committee, adding it to Annex III of the Basic Law. Then came the mass arrest in 2021, the 47 case, where nearly all opposition figures involved in the Legco primaries were detained. From that point on, it's fair to say that one country, two systems had come to an end. The central government restructured Hong Kong's Legislative Council. The number of seats increased from 70 to 90, but all candidates now had to pass through a nomination review committee. Only those considered patriotic and loyal to the party could run. District council elections were also overhauled. Previously, there were many directly elected seats, but those were mostly removed. The new system became dominated by vetted candidates, often pre-approved behind the scenes. In the most recent Legco election, not a single opposition figure won a seat. All 90 seats went to government-approved candidates. So, after over 20 years, the political experiment of one country, two systems came full circle. It began with space for opposition voices, but ended with their complete disappearance. Since 2020, and especially by July 1st this year, all major opposition parties have either disbanded or been forced out. They've become part of history. Looking back, I thought of what Martin Lee said in the early morning of July 1st, 1997, outside the Legislative Council building. He said, "Democracy is not just something Hong Kongers need. China needs it too. The best future would be for Hong Kong to move forward hand in hand with China. This is part of our shared heritage." That speech reflected the hopes of many, both in Hong Kong and on the mainland, at the time of the handover. But over the past 20 years, those hopes have been shattered. Martin Lee himself was later convicted, though given a suspended sentence, for his role in the 8.18 protest march. He also lost his honorary title of Justice of the Peace. Now in his 80s, I imagine even he may feel disheartened about the future of democracy in Hong Kong. As for my own view on why one country, two systems ultimately failed, I think the most important reason is this. To the Chinese Communist Party, one country, two systems was never something bound by law or protected by real institutional limits. In China, there are no systems or laws strong enough to constrain the party's power, not even in Hong Kong. After the handover, Hong Kong became a domestic issue. From Beijing's perspective, allowing one country, two systems was already a form of generosity toward Hong Kongers. But the people of Hong Kong misunderstood this. They believed they were in a long-term struggle with the party, negotiating, resisting, and pushing for more. And when negotiation failed, they turned to confrontation. But they treated the CCP like it was the British Empire, as if it might tolerate political pressure without striking back. But that's not how the CCP works. Once you cross the red line, once you reject what they're offering, they'll simply take it all back. That's the logic. What they give, they can take away. Now, if we look back at the 2017 political reform plan, I think the Chinese government had already made things very clear. They said there would no longer be a timetable for universal suffrage in Hong Kong. From now on, this would be the permanent plan. Candidates for chief executive must be approved by a nomination committee. Once a candidate gets over 50% support from the committee, 2 or 3 names are put forward, and then Hong Kong citizens can vote one person, one vote. That's it. That's Beijing's bottom line, its final offer. The core of it is that Beijing cannot and will not accept a chief executive who is against the central government. That's the red line. But the problem is that most pan-democratic forces in Hong Kong, and even ordinary citizens, never fully understood that bottom line. Many still believed that if they resisted hard enough, Beijing might eventually compromise. But to be honest, implementing one country, two systems in China has always been tricky. Let's try to look at it from the CCP's perspective. The system in mainland China is one-party rule, a centralized authoritarian regime. Two systems means that Hong Kong could keep its capitalist model, which includes things like competitive elections, but only if that system doesn't challenge Beijing's political control. Once Hong Kong's system threatens the party's authority, then from Beijing's view, two systems has crossed the one-country line. And what exactly is that line? Very simple. Hong Kong must never elect a chief executive who opposes Beijing. If that happens, say someone like Albert Ho gets elected and starts calling on the international community to support Hong Kong independence, what would Beijing do? How would the central government even interact with such a chief executive? The CCP simply doesn't have the experience or the willingness to deal with that kind of situation. That's why they won't allow it to happen in the first place. Their bottom line is extremely clear. But unfortunately, many in Hong Kong's opposition didn't fully understand that. From my personal point of view, accepting the 2017 reform plan might have actually been a good option. Sure, the chief executive election would still be tightly controlled. It wouldn't be a true universal vote. But Beijing had already promised that after electing the chief executive, the Legislative Council, LegCo, elections could then be fully democratic. If that had happened, it's likely the Pan-Democrats would have gained a majority in LegCo, while the chief executive would still be someone approved by Beijing. That would have created a unique kind of political balance, where LegCo represents the people and the chief executive represents the central government. In that scenario, both sides would be forced to negotiate, compromise, and cooperate. That kind of dynamic might have allowed Hong Kong to keep functioning and move forward. Of course, this plan was still far from genuine dual universal suffrage, but it was still better than what Hong Kong had right after the handover. I've always believed that when it comes to democratization or political reform, even an inch forward is better than a step back. What we need is incremental improvement, what economists call a Pareto improvement. Each step should make things better than the day before. The one thing we must avoid is major regression. But unfortunately, what happened in Hong Kong in the end was exactly that, a huge step backward. And that, I think, is truly a shame. Some people may say I sound like a reformist, and yes, I am. That's one part of it. The second part is this. The increasingly radical localist movement in Hong Kong also handed Beijing the perfect excuse. The more extreme factions, the so-called brave fighters and localists, pushed for Hong Kong independence, which directly violates China's anti-secession law. And when these radical groups started street clashes and violent protests, the Hong Kong government repeatedly aired footage of the Yuen Long incident, showing police cars on fire. That gave the central government exactly what it needed to justify a crackdown. That's why I believe sticking to legal, non-violent opposition is crucial. But sadly, after 2014, radical politics dominated Hong Kong's direction and gained wide public support. The 2019 District Council election, where the opposition achieved a sweeping victory, was proof of that public sentiment. Yet that victory ended up triggering Beijing's full-force response, leading to a wide-scale crackdown. That, to me, is a second major tragedy. Third, I think the failure of one country, two systems is not only a lost opportunity for Hong Kong, but also for China. If the model had succeeded, it could have served as a reference for political reform across the mainland. Many of us from China once hoped that Hong Kong could set an example through competitive elections. Together, with Taiwan on one side and Hong Kong on the other, there might have been space for future democratization. But after the national security law was passed, all opposition forces in Hong Kong were wiped out. There are no more dissenting voices. This is clearly a major loss for Hong Kong, but also for China's political future. To make matters worse, the law's passage also had an impact on Taiwan. The pro-independence Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, gained unprecedented support, largely because Beijing's failure in Hong Kong confirmed people's fears. One country, two systems was supposed to be the model shown to Taiwan. But when people saw what happened in Hong Kong, the message to Taiwan became clear. Never agree to reunification or you'll end up like Hong Kong. So in the end, it was a lose-lose situation for Hong Kong and for China. But history doesn't operate on what-ifs. There are no hypotheticals in history. The truth is, after over 20 years of experimentation, one country, two systems has failed in Hong Kong. None of us wanted this outcome, but it has become the unfortunate reality. That's all I wanted to share today. Thank you.
It has been the greatest honor and privilege of my life to share your home for 5 years and to have some responsibility for your future. Now, Hong Kong people are to run Hong Kong. That is the promise, and that is the unshakable destiny.
有啲人可能以為7月1號，既然我哋呢一班民選議員要落車，民主就完蛋啦。其實唔係，因為民主之火已經點着，我哋一定會重返立法會。